Bella and Carol, thank you so, so much for those beautiful presentations. Again, as I said, very insightful, and I really love the themes of composting and care and this practice of touch that is like relevant and prevalent in both of your practices. Carol, my first question goes to you. And I was just thinking if you could tell us a bit about the experience of working remotely on a project. Yeah, because you haven't been at Wising. So how was that whole experience?
Oh, okay, it was great. I mean, it was great to have such kind of full control, quite open, very open-ended, wasn't it? There weren't any real parameters apart from because it's digital, I think it was, and apart from the format, it was quite open-ended. So I really had fun with that. I really had fun. I'm always grateful for that opportunity to explore and be able to link the kind of historical and with the physical. So I really had fun looking at pineapples in a whole different way. I thought I'd really kind of explored a lot about pineapples, but you realize there's so much more to discover, and, so that was great. The changes caused me a little bit of I wouldn't say stress. It was quite interesting to observe my reaction to that, to my resistance to change and like attachment to a piece of work, which is something which I'm kind of I'm playing with at the minute because sometimes because I don't want to have this kind of attachment to work, and so yeah, because at the minute I'm trying to look at this whole thing about life being temporary and nature being so kind of fleeting and changing. So I was quite surprised by it. So it was a very useful process for me, I think, to accept change and just unpick what all that's about. Why, and just open my mind up a little bit. So very good. So thank you for that opportunity.
No the testing in how you react to change is an added bonus.
Well, it's something I struggle with nature as well. That whole thing about trying to control things and trying to, like Bella, your allotment. I'm quite fascinated by that and how the physicality of you taking on such a project. Because I know I'm like overwhelmed with my garden here. So.
Yeah, it is. It's really, it can be really overwhelming at times, and it's definitely part of the challenge of reconnecting with it last year wasn't just coming back to that space, but it was also attempting to see how I could integrate that doing that thing amongst all of my other commitments and life, which at the time felt completely impossible. And I think that the overwhelm of that is very real, and yet there are ways of squeezing it in and shaping it around the limitations of your capacity that make it possible and make it richer for that, I think, in lots of ways.
Yeah. Great. So I'll move on to my next question, which was around why we actually staged this discussion between the two of you. So aside from the very prominent intersections of your practice, Carol, you'd mentioned that you'd watched Bella speaking at an event that happened at Wising called From the Ground Up. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about this and what drew you to Bella's practice.
The term crypt time is not something I had come across before. It's not a term I was very familiar with, but I was very I felt very connected to it because I worked in the mental health industry for quite a while when I was in England. And I think that was one of the things that hit me most, that how people were forced into going with this kind of roller coaster of life, and trying to fit into these parameters that really don't work for them and actually make them more ill. So I think that really resonated with me about your practice, Bella, and the fact that you're addressing these issues and trying to, speak and advocate for disability. Because I think we take so much for granted sometimes. I was even kind of listening to me describing images that I take so much for granted because I know what my images are. So to have to break them down was actually quite challenging. I was quite conscious, like, actually, you haven't described your images. So the whole notion about quick time, I'm very conscious of caring more for myself, taking my practice back to nature and slowing down. Sometimes we rush around so much. I'm always conscious that I'm always tired. I don't really rest. My elder people here in the Caribbean, they always had a siesta. At lunchtime. The country used to shut down at lunchtime, everything closed. We don't do that anymore. Live in a nature island surrounded by the sea, yet with, like, when's the last time I've been for a sea bath or things like that. So just more conscious of just taking things a bit slower. So the processes I use, it can be quite frustrating sometimes because the tendency is you want to speed it up. You want to, like, why don't I have time to make my paint? Why don't I have time to grind my pigments? That kind of thing. So I was very interested in how you and what kind of things you put in place to care for yourself and take time for yourself, acknowledge when you don't feel well.
Yeah, Bella, would you
be
able
to hear
to
a
give
little bit more?
I was going to say, Bella, could you tell us a bit about that event and also just how you see that now within the context of seeing Carol's new work for Rising and understanding that talk had some influence on it?
Oh, I mean, it's so touching to be thought of in the context of this work. And, it was wonderful to be invited by Hannah Wallace and to share the stage with Karani Brocker and talk about Crypt Time and especially share our work that directly, there's a kind of a continual, like, directness and indirectness. Everything is Crypt Time for me because that's the nature of my existence, and the work emerges from that space. And sometimes I'm addressing that directly, like I did with the work that I shared in that event, which was a poem that I wrote about finding disabled community and seeing your experience reflected within that, using Crypt Time as a kind of storytelling narrative, essentially, in that way. And then other times it's building a garden that takes forever to form a shape that you think that you're trying to build it into. And the daily making aspect of my work is like another kind of strand of that, in that, again, it's this kind of what kind of constantly chasing this sense of immersion that's, I think some of the things that we first connected with, Carol, was around kind of experiences of fragmentation within our work, and that kind of is very much present in how my making occurs. And so that kind of elusive immersiveness of wanting to be amongst that creative reverie, as Abby Palmer often describes it, as another wonderful disabled artist who talks about Crypt Time a lot in a brilliant way. And that kind of creative reverie is, it's almost kind of it doesn't really exist. And so there's you have to kind of find alternative kind of formats to that, which is where I find for me the daily making, there's immersiveness is found through these kind of small counter disruptions to the kind of constant disruptions that is living with illness. And I really like thinking about my practice being this kind of counter creative disruption. And the allotment, studio allotment, is another format of that, in the kind of the way in which the site is constantly visually very disrupted as a space, and fragmented in the kind of aesthetics of that space is very, there's these kind of, it's very chaotic, and there's lots of different kind of conflicting materials that all knit together to form the very kind of understood narrative of that space, being, materials and kind of like bodged together buildings of greenhouses and sheds and things like that. But then when I'm also trying to create a kind of a different, very formal space, there's this kind of, this constant kind of tension and pushing back, and that I really enjoy playing with in that way, these kind of counter disruptions visually and then experientially as well. And I think the way you described there, Carol, just the kind of challenge of compromise it's such a creative ouch, right? It's such a wound to like kind of to be affronted with the realities of what you aspire your work to be, is very it's very powerful. And I think when we kind of I think what was so wonderful to connect with you in your work in this way is sharing that kind of those notions of what compromise can facilitate. I think is really exciting for me. I think compromise is the most underrated, underlooked kind of resource, really, in terms of what we can achieve through our making, through our creative endeavors and thinking in that way. And in actually, we have this the vision, the dream, this is what it has to be, this is what it has to embody, and compromise comes along and just goes no. and I love being kind of humbled by that. I think it's a really and I think for me personally it's a way of finding, or almost kind of like finding autonomy in that kind of way that I'm not in control, and that's like being allowed to be led by that, the lack of control that's very different from my experience of my body, which is like complete no control, and I'm at the mercy of that, something that a compromise in a very different kind of way. And I think I like being able to kind of draw from that and apply it in a creative sense that is much more, there's a different kind of freedom that's found in that. And I loved the way you shared that, again, your generosity in sharing that, I think is really valuable. And I think as artists, we don't share that enough, that the kind of those kind of moments of compromise that actually generates really exciting creative experiences that otherwise wouldn't have happened, I think is a really a powerful sharing. And I think the way your work exists at Wising, that kind of fragmentation is amazing. I think it's a really powerful piece.
Quite an interesting moment, because the thing with the parchment and the light actually almost happened at the same time as the Stuart Hall Club, because I was and the two things almost happened like simultaneously. And, what was all that about? So that was quite a revolution, and quite refreshing, really. So
yes, I think so. I think it facilitates a different playfulness in your work, not just in the kind of the how the work is produced, but like how you actually feel about the kind of formal ending point. Because I think what's really exciting about playing with compromise and immersing yourself in that kind of allowing yourself to be led by that is that and I think, I mean, my process is such a, as you shared, Carol, it's such a core part of the work for me. The kind of final experience, final artwork is just one component of the whole body of the work. The work exists in all of these different stages, all of these different kind of twists and turns, of which, the kind of final outcome is just one kind of one facet of that.
And it's also kind of a lesson in trust as well. I mean, because opening up, letting go, and trust, because to a certain extent I had to trust the photographer that he was going to do a great job, and trust the printers, and trust Wisey, and just say, right, I'm not in control of these elements of it, I've produced the work, given it a lot of thought, now this bit is out of my control, and trust that, it'd be right. So.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really,
I'm not quite sure what. Is that better?
Yeah.
That is really good. Thank you, Carol.
I think as well, that trust bit is really, it's really powerful, and it's also really vulnerable making, isn't it? Like we have to be like, it's a quite a vulnerable position to allow ourselves, even kind of in our internal creative spaces, where it's just us thinking and making and following those kinds of lines. There's vulnerability to it, but then externally, in these kind of public and professional settings as well, that trust is really, it's a really vulnerable thing. And I'm really glad that it's paid off, and it's something that's been a positive experience for you, because allowing yourself to trust that process can be really powerful.
Yeah, I had one of my questions for both of you was thinking about this, because we'd spoken previously, and actually today both of you have touched on these areas of thinking about control, and but I was sort of thinking about it completely as like all outside, but actually within the framework of an institution as well. That's like a massive part of it. So I was like, oh, it must be there's a sense of play in this sort of, I don't know, challenges of control over gardens and things. But actually, all of those decisions as well also definitely go into like informing your life and your work and things like that. And what types of practices are normally put in these like institutional frameworks and in galleries and things. So I guess one of my questions to both of you was thinking about like how you find working outside and in nature when you're sort of thinking about those frameworks, and how that has an effect on both of your practices.
Do you want to speak first on that, then?
Unless you have do you want to say first, or?
It's one.
I don't mind.
When I looked through the questions, it's the one I thought, it's the one.
It's a really good one.
Yeah.
It's a really good one.
Question I did think about. It is. I suppose it is a challenge, but I also think the art world is changing quite a lot. It's kind of what it touched me, Ruth, is when you talked about that image of the pineapple being a beautiful image, and I never really think about using my images in that way as pieces of artwork in themselves, which is actually quite interesting. I might put the image on a blog or use it as part of, but as a piece of artwork in itself, it's not something that I've considered to use images of process, I suppose, as pieces of artwork. But like Wising, Wising work in a very different way, I think, to traditional contemporary gallery space. But it is something I'm kind of questioning at the minute, how I can incorporate my work into a gallery setting, or without it being like a physical piece and things like that. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but it is a question that I'm thinking about a lot. Yeah, just playing with that, thinking how we can take work forward in a different way. And capture that whole, because again, it's something I struggle with, that whole working with nature, the fact that things might fade and things might rot and that kind of thing. I mean, you, Bella, you talked a lot about your plant pressings being so beautiful in that flat stage, and they're actually something really beautiful and fragile about them, isn't it? And like you said, shadows when you lift them, and yeah, what do you do with that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really challenging to when I think about my practice in the context of kind of a formal exhibiting practice, the facet of my work, that definitely is a driver of what a creative experience to share and to display work in that setting. But making work outside is a really great. I loved the question in that respect. I think it's a really interesting kind of thing to think about, because whilst there isn't a component of it that feels completely at odds with the idea of it being some kind of gallery display, it also doesn't feel like, again, a bit like how I was talking about the an artwork as a static, wholly defined I can't say the word, sealed, perfectly sealed thing, doesn't really it's that isn't a really big driver of my work in that way. And I think that's why the studio allotment and the gardening practice, that feels like such kind of like such a foundational fuel of my work in that way. And so I think a large motivation around reconnecting with that part of my studio practice was to kind of replenish my creative reserves that had been really depleted after a lot of intense kind of professional commission-based work, which was wonderful and amazing. And also, that kind of studio internal facing felt lacking of my time and energy, just like you talked about, Carol, like when we have the time to sit and play and do these things. And the there's a kind of demanding nature of the allotment space that requires that attention, that's it really kind of fuels that creative thinking. And also, when I was talking about doing this talk to someone the other day, I was saying, it's the first time. This is my debut for my studio allotment sharing in a public space. Like I've talked about it to friends and peers and things like that, but I have yet to kind of display it, because it really serves as this internal function. It's this kind of like I say, I'm sculpting this space, I'm creating this kind of bank of ideas, of thinking, of really kind of like a dedicated time area in many ways, which is kind of really exciting to think about. And so it's a bit, like I said, a bit like what I was talking about with the artwork being just one component of the making. The working outside, working in a garden kind of feels like that is something that might never ever happen with it. It might never appear in a space outside of this. This might just be, and that's very much not a lacking in that respect. It's very much I keep having this kind of thing in my head. It's the doing it that's the thing. It's the doing it that's the thing. And I'm kind of constantly pulling on that thread, just constantly pulling on that thread with it, which is complex in a different kind of lots of different facets of making and where making exists and its experience. But yeah, I love it.
And,
I
and
hope
that's
that.
why this kind of conversation is so important, and so thank you to Wellington for. I think just acknowledging how important this process is and about artists talking about the process, because a lot of that's lost in a finished piece of work. You see the end result, you don't really know what the thinking is necessarily behind it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's where I find in these kind of settings, like you say, it's so lovely to connect with you here and share these ideas together. And whenever I'm invited to kind of talk about my work in this way, I never really want to talk about something that was displayed somewhere in lots of ways, because I kind of think this stuff, these kind of bits, the how of it, the what the is there's there's a real value to that, especially within other for how others can find that in their own making as well.
And I guess that's where galleries can move forward, that to incorporate somehow more of that in gallery settings and get a little bit away from the traditional kind of wall space. I'm not sure how they do that, but get away a little bit. There's still room for that.
Absolutely, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think it just invites so much different kinds of thinking, as well as the wonder that is an exhibition as well.
No, it's just really interesting, and it's so great to hear you both talk, because I think there's so much collaboration in both of your practices, with both people, the ideas. You've both mentioned, cultural theorists, but also poets. And so it's really interesting to hear those sort of collaborations that you hold, and you have them sort of in your mind when you are making, and how that affects what comes out, and like the finished thing, which is never really finished, because it's always like an ongoing conversation that you're having. So it's really interesting to hear both of those insights and thoughts on that. I think we've got, if it's okay, time for a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. I was thinking a lot of today, we've been thinking about your practices and having space and time for rest and care. And I was wondering, what do you think viewers to your practices and viewers of this talk could take away to encourage spaces of rest? And what would you say to other artists who are looking for places that might nurture them, or give them that space and time?
Well, it's very important to enjoy what you do. So that element of play to me is very important. I mean, and I think enjoyment of what you do, and try not to be too pressured about things. That's probably what I want people, and think about everything as being a potential creative material, especially in this kind of world that we're living in today. Don't be limited if you don't have a expensive brush or pens, because there's always something you can use to be creative.
Yes, I think you nailed it there, Carol, with the joy, finding ways of accessing joy in our making is just so crucial. And I really don't say that lightly, because the world we live on is really hard set on ensuring a deficit of joy in lots of ways, and it's really difficult when things are really hard. And I think within professional context of an artistic practice, again, the joy is just not a priority for so many exchanges that we are commissioned or have. And so it's really it's challenging, but also essential, because it's not, I don't find it possible to kind of continue that momentum without returning back to that the nature of the making, which is play, which is finding pleasure in kind of being, kind of spending time with ideas and materials and spaces that excite and inspire. And I think it's difficult with the talking, what rest and finding space for rest amongst that, I think it's really challenging, I think, because, and I don't necessarily think I would have like necessarily advice around that, because again, I think I made a piece of work earlier this year that talked about this kind of sense of, we're all dreaming of rest, right? This is where, we dream of it both in a longing and a kind of a lacking. And I think it's how we kind of, I guess, utilizing those kind of that experience of that desire to push back against the demands of all of us is I think does allow to feed a prioritization of rest in a different way. And again, I really don't say that lightly, because it really isn't possible for lots of people to kind of just say, oh, I'm just going to prioritize rest over everything. Like, it's really, I've definitely, there's a lot of, politics and costs that come to prioritizing rest, like turning down work and things like that, income that is otherwise essential or whatever. So I think it's very challenging. And also, I think what I would say, perhaps in terms of any kind of like advice on that, is finding ways of rooting our practices and our understanding of rest in disability culture, in disability justice movements, that have so much richness and wisdom to share on people that are at the kind of pointy end of limitations of capacity and time, and what we can learn from those spaces, and the way people have radically shifted the ways in which they do things and make. I think only like the learning that I continue to practice amongst my disabled peers is just forever inspiring, and I'm always kind of finding new joys of that understanding, and in what rest can facilitate in how it can bring new kind of insights into our making in that way. So I would say that in terms of advice, rather than just find the time, because it doesn't really exist like that.
Yeah, especially within trying to have a practice was it's a difficult thing to think about.
And I think
because we're forced to rest, then, aren't we? We get ill, and then we're like forced to we're forced to rest and take more time than ever. So
absolutely, there's like sometimes there's a real tension, and when I talk about crypt time for me personally, because there's like crypt time is this like such like beautiful, inspiring, incredible thing that just is shared and connected, and we can think about all these different things and find autonomy and expression of our existence in this new way, and it's wonderful. And then also there's just like the other side, another aspect of crypt time, which is just like I'm just in bed and ill and can't do anything, and like that's also an element, that's also what crypt time can be too, that it's it's experienced in so many different ways. And I think like you say, this kind of like the way in which you can be pinned into a space like that is also, in terms of how we access rest, is also challenging.
So I'm going to ask you both my final question, because I'm afraid we are definitely over time. But I was just going to ask, what's next for both of you, and where can we follow and see more of your work?
Oh, you go, Carol.
I don't have any set projects at the moment. I'm involved with an art group here, so there's always, and I think I'm always, part of my work is just developing and really just trying to find more time to develop my technique in making paints, making pigments from soil. What I'm trying to do is develop pigments from soil found on walks I go on the island. So that's in the process of developing that at the minute, grounding things down, and let's see where it goes.
Incredible. And there'll be the billboard up at Wising. So if any visitors want to come, that will be on the side of the new block. But Bella, yeah.
So as you can see, the roses are coming into bloom. That's really exciting. The space is continuing at the studio allotments, continuing to be sculpted, and is very much. I mean, it's really like I'm just it's at the forefront of all of my thinking currently, and I'm completely in awe of it, and that's very much my studio practice is kind of taken up with that. And I'm also working on a project called Further Afield at the moment, which is in collaboration with Level Centre, and it's also supported by Wising, and I'm going to be, and a number of other partners, and I'm going to be having interviews with other disabled artists who are either rurally based or who make work in rural spaces, and we're going to be talking about disabled experiences in rural settings, essentially, and that is just I feel so lucky to be doing that project. It's really, really, really exciting, and there's just the opportunity to talk to some really wonderful artists is just wonderful. And then I'll be coming to Wising on residency in the autumn, which is really wonderful. So I've got a fun year ahead of me.
Well, that is great. So thank you so much, Carol, and thank you, Bella, for joining me this afternoon. And thank you, Lucy, as well, for all of your technical support. It's been wonderful to hear from both of you, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Bella. Thank you, Wising. And I look forward to seeing the work installed.
Yeah, so excited, Carol. It looks absolutely amazing. I can't wait to experience it. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was really touched to be thought of for this. It's what your work is brilliant, Carol. It's been wonderful to collaborate with you on this.